Perhaps humans were fated to build the monoliths.
Hi, welcome back to Gaming Bench. Today I want to look at something a little unusual for your typical GPU benchmarks. I want to look at Once Human. This is a free-to-play, pay-to-win game that uses Unreal Engine 4, not Unreal Engine 5, so there's no Nanite or Lumina engine going on. But it's relatively popular. I mean, it's probably close to the top 10 on Steam for the past couple of months since it came out. Has about 100,000 concurrents as of right now, and I want to see how it runs on a variety of hardware. Now, there's a few disclaimers that I need to toss out here. One, AMD was working with DirectX 12 earlier this month. It suddenly broke with a game patch. I don't know why. So I had to use DirectX 11 mode for the AMD cards, which I couldn't do on the Nvidia cards if I wanted to use DLSS and FrameGen. It wouldn't show XeSS and DLSS as options unless you're in DirectX 12 mode. So that's all a little odd. I mean, the game gets updates all the time. So I did all of the testing in one day today, September 28th, and I'm doing the, videos on it. So I'm going to look at the RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XTX first. These are two high-end, extreme, nearly $1,000 graphics cards. I mean, you can find the XTX for about $900 sometimes. And the 4080 Super, sometimes it starts at around $950. A lot of models will cost more than that, but that's kind of the base level pricing. And at 1080p with the middle preset, not medium, middle, whatever, and no upscaling, you can see they're basically running neck and neck. The 4080 Super is just a hair faster, like 3 to 5%. One thing to be clear on is minor differences I'm not going to make a big deal about because there's different times of day, different weather. Those all seem to have maybe a few percent difference on your performance. So, if it's sunny versus at night or foggy versus rainy or whatever, that can make maybe a 5% difference between the cards. So I'm mostly looking at the bigger differences like 10 to 20% or more. So overall, the 4080 Super, second fastest card at 1080p middle. The 4090 is just a hair faster, which means we're pretty much hitting CPU limits, and that's expected. And you can see that with the AMD 7900 XTX and GRE, which are effectively tied. So CPU bottlenecks definitely coming into play on the fastest GPUs. Let's go ahead and kick up to 1080p and the very high preset. And you can see here that the XTX has bumped into the lead. It's not like a huge difference, maybe 5 to 7%. So this could be just differences in the time of day and other stuff, not something to really get worried about. Minimums are about the same, right around 150 FPS. And the game is still very playable. Anything of over 120 frames per second, I wouldn't worry about like, oh, it's not fast enough. In a game like this, you could easily play at like 60 frames per second. It's not this, highly competitive shooter where you got to snipe people in a fraction of a second like Counter-Strike 2. This is more of like a survival game and run around and chop things down. Overall charts, you can still see that there's clear bottlenecks appearing on some of those GPUs where the minimums are at 150. The GRE should be quite a bit slower than the XTX if CPU bottlenecks aren't a factor. I mean, the 4090 is like almost 15% faster than the 4080 Super, and that's relatively close for those two GPUs. I mean, at higher resolutions and such, the 4090 could easily be 30% faster than the 4080 Super. So let's go to higher resolutions and stuff. 1440p. Now this gets interesting because XTX jumps to the lead. 195 frames per second. That is not like a fluke. I tested it multiple times. Could be DirectX 11. I did not test the 4090, 4080, and other cards in DirectX 11 mode, so bear that in mind. But the 4080 Super is getting like 150-ish frames per second. 148 is what my chart will say. And the 7900 XTX is getting 195 frames per second. I mean, that's like a huge gap. Even the 4090 only got 180 frames per second. I suspect it's the difference in API. And it kind of frustrates me that DirectX 12 mode stopped working on AMD GPUs, but such is life. Here's the full chart. and you've seen it. And let's go ahead and go to the highest resolution. And this is interesting because after just showing the 7900 XTX at nearly 200 frames per second, it basically drops in half. It's still ahead of the 4080 Super. Could be DirectX 11 still, but it's tied now with the 4090, which again, that's way better than it normally would do if a game is running properly on all the GPUs. But the 4080 Super is getting about 84, 85 frames per second compared to almost 110 frames per second on the XTX card. So AMD's doing pretty well overall, but I can't draw any firm conclusions just because of the API differences and the bugginess that I experienced with the DirectX 12 mode on AMD right now. I mean, like it locks up the game right as you load into the level for me. I've tried the 24.6.1, 24.7.1, 24.8.1, and the 24.20.11.01. None of them work in DirectX 12 mode right now, and that wasn't the case like 2 weeks ago. So I don't think it's really AMD's fault. They didn't change their drivers, but the developers for Once Human kind of screwed things up. Last but not least, we have upscaling enabled, and the 4080 can also enable frame generation, DLSS 3 frame generation. So we've got two things to look at. First is running upscaling only, and you can see the 7900 XTX is getting 129, 130 frames per second on average compared to 118 on the 4080 Super. Neither of those is a huge bump in performance considering we're rendering half as many pixels and then upscaling, but DLSS did give the 4080 Super a bigger boost than FSR gave to the AMD card. But this is FSR2, not FSR3, so maybe that's also a factor. Anyway, you're only getting like 20 frames per second, so like less than a 20% boost in performance on the 7900 XTX, whereas the 4080 Super got more like a 35 to 40% boost, which is more in line with what I would expect to see. And then of course there's frame generation, which you can see again doesn't do a whole lot for the Nvidia card. I mean, the 4080 Super goes from almost 120 to almost 145 frames per second if we're looking at the charts. And so that's like less than a 20% boost again. So, you know, you add the two together, frame generation and upscaling, and it makes a decent difference in performance, but latency is worse on frame generation by like 10 to 15 milliseconds for these higher end cards, I think is what I measured. Anyway, that about does it. Tell me what you think. You like these Once Human benchmarks? Please like and subscribe. Let me know other games you'd like to test, other GPUs. I will see how the traffic does on these Once Human videos. I want to do, 4 of these for budget, mid-range, high-end, and this one's the extreme GPU. So I want to see, like, are there cards that people on YouTube tend to see more or tend to watch more? If so, I might focus more on those cards in the future while we wait for the next generation RDNA 4 and the Blackwell RTX 50 series to come out, which probably won't be until early 2025. Thanks for watching again. We'll see you next time.